Welcome to Daniel Code Productions. My name is Greg Bratcher and I'll be your host. And we are going to be looking at some fascinating material that is going to help us understand our world in light of prophecy. And when I'm talking about prophecy, we're going to be starting with the book of Daniel, which is the most interesting book that I've read, and I've read a lot of books. So I hope you'll relax and enjoy. I am just a layperson who has a passion for the book of Daniel. And people ask me, well, why is that? And I'm going to share with you why that is. And part of the reason is Daniel is a very geographic, political, specific event type book. It's easy for almost anyone to understand who has an open mind and will look into it. It actually gives some very specific details about a military struggle going on in the Middle East. It actually names countries by name, countries such as Libya and Egypt. You find in Daniel 11:43. We're going to talk about that. Sudan is actually mentioned there as well. And what we find from the book of Daniel is that it was sealed. It's a mysterious book, particularly the end of the book of Daniel. Almost no one can understand it, it seems. And that's what makes it so fascinating and interesting. And it's only recent events that have unsealed the book. I believe events from the Arab Spring that happened in 2011 has helped bring some events that have happened there recently when President Obama told Mubarak, the president of Egypt, to step down. He eventually did step down. And when Obama told Libyan President Muammar Gaddafi to step down, very soon NATO came and they eventually killed Gaddafi. And I believe those are fulfilled literal events that have been predicted in the book of Daniel to help us understand our times in light of Bible prophecy. And so that's what we're about at Daniel Code Productions. So come and listen, and I will share with you some fascinating, interesting, and good news that's going to help you to be prepared for the future. Now, I know we all want to have our families prepared for the future. I know I do. And I know there's all kinds of different ways that people are doing that today. The doomsday preppers who are building bunkers and storing canned food and getting guns. That's one way of preparing for the future. Many different people have many different ways. My way is to look at prophecy and understand it in a very rational, reasonable method way. And what I find today is there's a lot of gullible people out there today who really don't know the Bible and who don't know much about history. And I'm trying to educate people about how we can better understand what's going on. And hopefully that's going to lead us into positive aspects so that the children of Abraham will be a blessing and not a curse upon the world. And so let's look at that, shall we? I'm going to start with Jesus. He's always a man of wisdom. Confucius had a lot of wisdom. Mahatma Gandhi had much wisdom. But the wisest man that I've known, King Solomon had a lot of wisdom. But I believe that Isa, the prophet Isa, as is called by my Muslim friends, or Jesus, as we call him in the West, or Yeshua, as some of our Jewish friends may call him, was the Messiah, and who had great wisdom from above. And that's what we need today, is wisdom from above to help us understand our times and to be ready for what is coming. So let's look at Matthew 24 verse 15 is where I'd like to start. Jesus was with his disciples, and they looked at him as they were on the Mount of Olives, very near the time of his completion of his ministry in 30 AD. And he looked over at the temple, this beautiful temple that the Jews there were very proud of. And he told them not one stone would be left upon another. And many of us are nationalists. We're proud of our nation. We're proud of many things. And they were that same way. They were proud of that beautiful temple that had taken 46 years to build. And they were shocked by that. That was not what they wanted to hear. And often Jesus will tell us things that we don't want to hear, but we need to believe Him and follow where those things lead. And they said, now what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And He began to give them many signs, and they believed that when Jesus would come again, that would be the end of the age. It would be all one event. And I believe that today. Do you believe that? Or do they get separated maybe by a rapture and then later Jesus comes? There's some interesting teachings going on today, and we're going to discuss some of those things as we get deeper into the book of Daniel. And the book of Daniel will bring much clarity for us because it's a very easy book to understand if we have used the right uncoding methods. And so if we look now at Matthew 24 and verse 15, I'm going to read it for you. You know, Jesus said there were many signs, wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, and many of those things have happened already and will continue to happen. But there was one unique and important sign that Jesus gave in Matthew 24:15. He says this. He says, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. And then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, when Jesus gave that prophecy to His disciples, He then went on to talk about a great time of great distress that would come after, and then eventually He would come in the clouds of glory in verse 30. Now, He was compressing a lot of history in Matthew 24. He was talking about things that would happen in that generation that Peter and Paul lived in, the first century, and then even things that would happen at the very end of time. And this is where people get a little confused with these things. The abomination of desolation, as spoken by the prophet Daniel, we're going to find out is a technical term that was used in the book of Daniel, and it was used 3 times. And so what I'm going to show is that that was fulfilled in 1st century AD. It was also fulfilled in the Middle Ages, and it'll also be filled in the last days of Earth's history. And most important, we want to understand that last day fulfillment that's going to happen, I believe, in our time. So let's look into that, shall we? And what we know from history is this, that when Jesus made that prediction, it didn't come until many years later. The war broke out. The Jews went to war against the Roman, trying to throw off the Romans there. And what happened was eventually the Romans sent their armies to Jerusalem, and they surrounded the city with a 5-month siege. That was a terrible siege. People were eating their own children. It was a terrible time. And eventually there was a great slaughter, and the temple was completely destroyed, just as Jesus said it would be. But those who were there in the city remembered the words of Jesus, and they said when they saw the abomination of desolation as spoken by the prophet Daniel in the holy place, they saw the Romans bringing their standards. The Romans had these gods, if you will, that they would bring and believe that brought them power in battle. And they saw that, the Jewish believers, they remembered the words of Jesus, they passed the word around, and we know from the Christian historian named Eusebius, who wrote this a couple of hundred years later, that they quietly, when the opportunity arose, fled the city. They went to the mountains, they went north, and then they went across the Jordan River to a place called Pella. And there they were able to settle and live freely for quite some time, the rest of their lives. And so because they listened to the words of Jesus and remembered and paid attention to them, it saved their lives from destruction. And I believe that event will happen again at the very end of time. So let's pay attention to the words of Jesus and the words of Daniel. And if we go back to Daniel chapter 9, Daniel chapter 9 makes a clear prediction of when the Messiah would come and then when the temple would be destroyed. And we go to Daniel 9:26. I'm going to read from 9:26 and 27. It says this: after 62 sevens, the Anointed One will come and be cut off and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end will come like a flood. And then in verse 27 it says, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation. And so we see from Daniel chapter 9 verse 26, historicist scholars have understood this 70 weeks that were given as years, of weeks of years, if you will. Each week representing 7 years, or a day equal a year, so that you take 70 times 7 and gives you 490. And from the time, it says, from the issuing forth of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Now, there were actually 3 decrees, but when we look back in hindsight, there's only really one that fit with the baptism of Jesus around 27 AD. He came and he was baptized by John the Baptist. We know this from the book of Luke. And so when you go back in hindsight and see when Jesus' ministry started, subtract 27 AD and you get back to about the year 457 BC, which we find in the book of Ezra, the decree that was made there. So when the temple was rebuilt, the Jews had kept count of time. They had kept and they knew when the Messiah was to become, he was to be cut off, it says. And we know from history that it means that he would die. We know from the Dead Sea Scrolls that in the book of Melchizedek scroll, it's called, it talks about the coming of Melchizedek, and they recognized that there was a time period based on the book of Daniel that there would be 490 years, and they counted it down by jubilees. They took 7 years times 7 is 1 jubilee, 49 years, and they said it would be 10 jubilees before this event would happen. The Messiah would come and be cut off. And then it also says here that the temple would be destroyed. And so we see this was fulfilled in Christian historian Philip Schaff, who's very well recognizes that the fulfillment of the abomination of desolation as spoken by the prophet Daniel happened from Daniel 9:26 and 27 was fulfilled. Now, if we continue to study the book of Daniel, we find that term, the abomination of desolation, is actually in 2 other places later in the book of Daniel. We find it in Daniel 11:31 and Daniel 12:11. And so I believe it represents 3 fulfillments, and I'm looking at this from a historicist perspective, and basically we believe that there was a fulfillment in the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, during the Crusades. That's what many historicist scholars have understood Daniel 11:31 to be, and then also at the very end of time in Daniel 12:11. And so what I'd like to do is we'll come back now to the Middle Ages later, but I'm going to get to the very end of time. The most irrelevant time is our time, and the book of Daniel helps us to understand the context of that event that's going to happen, of the abomination of desolation in the last day. And what we have to understand is a couple of principles. One is this. In the Daniel 11, it's very chronological. The events happen, and then it happens the next event, then the next event, and the next event. Once you recognize the event, you know the next one has to be in the future. And that's what makes it relatively easy to understand. Then the other part is that Jerusalem is always the center. The king of the north is always literally north of Jerusalem. The king of the south is always literally south of Jerusalem. If you keep those 2 principles in mind, the Daniel 11 is fairly easy to understand. And so let's go into it, shall we? And we find in Daniel 12, verse 1, a very interesting text. I'm going to read for you Daniel 12:1. It says this: "At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. And there will be a time of distress such as not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered." Now, I look forward to that time when Michael arises to deliver his people. And those who really study Scripture don't have a problem understanding Michael delivering the protector of the people and the one who delivers them. You know, Paul calls Michael the only archangel and says that we will hear his voice at the second coming of Christ. And, and so we find that Michael, which his name actually means one who is like God, is actually a symbol for Jesus. And there are those who would try to refute that, but that's fine. What we need to do is try to really understand these things. And if we get bogged down in symbols, sometimes we get lost in the details. But if you look at the big picture, in Daniel chapter 2, you see an image of gold, a head of gold, and all these different medals that represent the empires that controlled the Middle East from the time of Daniel all the way to the end of time, to the modern nations of Europe today. And during that, where the feet of clay and iron come, there's a stone that comes and destroys that. Go back and read it, Daniel 2, and destroys that structure, and that is represents as the stone represents Christ and His kingdom that will come. And when Jesus comes, He will come and destroy the wicked and deliver His people, His true people. And so I look forward to that day, and I believe it's coming sooner than we realize. And what we find at Daniel 11 and 12 is basically is telling us in different symbols the same story. In the outline prophecies of Daniel 2, Daniel 7, and then Daniel 11 and 12 are all telling us that same story. And that in Matthew 24 is telling us the same story, that Jesus would come again. So Jesus is obviously Michael. He is coming to deliver His people. And right before, He says, at that time, the time that Michael arises to come deliver us from a great distress, we have to ask the question, at what time? And if we know that the book of Daniel is chronological, we have to go to the very previous verse to find out at the time that Michael arises to deliver his people. And let's look at that in Daniel 11:45. It says this: He, being the king of the north, will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain. And yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. Now, the question is, how will this event, this being the, it says here, the king of the north will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain. Now what we find is that the beautiful holy mountain here is centered in Jerusalem. The beautiful holy mountain in Isaiah often represents God's people, but in Daniel, the holy mountain is the same holy mountain that Daniel referred to in Daniel 9, verse 20. It is in Jerusalem at Mount Moriah, where the King Solomon's temple was built. And we know where that place is today, and that place is what is called Al-Aqsa Mosque, or the Wailing Wall. It's all basically the same place there in Jerusalem, where we find a lot of religious people fighting holy battles over holy ground going on today. And trying to put meaning in that is what we're all about here in Daniel 11. You know, should we be fighting for land today in the name of the Messiah? We need to talk some more about that, I think. I think some people have become confused and gotten away from the simple teachings of Jesus. But that's a side story. We'll come back to that. But in Daniel, it says that he would pitch his royal tents. And when we look at the Hebrew, it reminds us of the ancient traditions that the divine war tent, the divine royal war tent that many kings would take to battle with them. And often it would have an opening, a pavilion, so that the people could see and come and worship there. And it seems that that type of event is going to happen in Jerusalem. We're all going to see it. And the king of the north, the question is, who is this king of the north? And how will he do this with all of the going on today in the Middle East? And so I'm going to sum it up right here and take a little break. There's three main characters in the book of Daniel at the very end. There's the king of the north, the king of the south, and the God of forces. If you understand who those modern powers are today, you will clearly understand what Daniel 11 is telling us will happen and how this event will happen. So let's take a little break here, and we'll be right back and explain that for you. Thank you. Welcome back to Daniel Code Productions. We're going to help you understand Daniel 11 by understanding the three main characters: the king of the north, the king of the south, and the God of forces. Now, what we have to understand is this. When we talk about these events from prophecy, we're not talking about individual persons. You know, Jesus tells us we are not to judge people, and we don't know why people do what they do. So I don't judge any particular person. What I'm talking about are systems that we are warned about, systems of political and religious systems that have been around for quite some time, that that Jesus warned us about, that Daniel warned us about, and that we who live in a free country can talk about freely, and and we can respect one another, and maybe we might disagree, but I'm going to try to be fair from Scripture, and you hold me accountable. Show me if I go wrong, but I'm trying to stay close to Scripture so we can understand, and by understanding we can be prepared for the events that are about to take place in our world. So I find there's three main characters, and one of the ways that I've gained understanding is by reading what others teach. And there's a good book that I have read not too long recently. It's called Constantine's Sword by James Carroll. James Carroll is a former Catholic priest, and it's a good book. I recommend it. And in that book, he goes to talk about Constantine himself, the Emperor Constantine. And that when Constantine was at a very critical time, he went to the Malvern Bridge in Italy, and he was fighting for the control of the empire. And as a warrior going into battle, he was afraid, and he longed for the help of divine providence. He wanted God on his side. And he tells the story of that, how he had a vision, and he looked up into the sky, and he saw a cross, if you will. He saw the chi and the rho, the first two letters of Christos in the Greek, and it says, "In this sign you shall conquer," is what he told later. And so he took his soldiers and he put upon them, told them to put this symbol on their shields when they went into battle, and to give them power in a kind of a superstitious way. And the precedent was set by him, and they won that battle. He became the emperor of the Roman Empire, and he told that story. But he set that precedent where he took this kind of a cross that, and he used it as a symbol to go into battle with, where he took the cross into battle, and bringing together military force with a religious cause of Christ. And later it developed into what we call the labarum. It was the standards that they would use taking into battle. And then much later, I'm going to cover a lot of history here. We go to the year 1095. And what happened then in 1095 AD, Pope Urban II declared the first Christian crusade to go and take the Holy Land back, the holy places that were under the control of the Muslims at that time. And when he did that, eventually they made the cross, the Latin cross, the sign of the Crusaders, and when they went to use force to fight over the Holy Land. And eventually that idea caught on not just against Muslims, but it was the crusading against heretics and others who differed with the faith of Rome became a standard practice, if you will, where they would go and they would slaughter whole villages and cities. They would often allow people the chance to save their lives by converting, or they could be burned at the stake, or they could be tortured with the Inquisition and the methods that were used there. And so what we find is this idea of imposing religion with force, and which others are beginning to use today, even in other avenues. And so this idea of crusading for Christ was what took over during the Dark Ages. And because of that, many people fled from Europe, and they came to the New World, and they sought freedom in order that they may have civic freedom and from kings, and religious freedom from popes and archbishops and all of the church hierarchy that had established during the Dark Ages. And so, I believe very strongly in the principles that founders of the United States Constitution and the United States stands for, and the freedom of religion, and the other Bill of Rights as well. but particularly the freedom of religion and freedom of speech, that we have that freedom here in America and I'm going to promote that freedom of religion and freedom of speech here at Daniel Code Productions and allow others the freedom as well. And so, there are certain principles that if we believe in, we be willing to be consistent with those principles. And one is the freedom of religion. I believe in my freedom of religion, and so if I'm going to believe for my freedom of religion, I must also grant others that same privilege, that though they may differ with me, though they may be Hindu or atheist or Jewish or Muslim, that I will respect them and their faith. And so I want to allow everyone the freedom to choose their religion. And so I'm going to stand for that. I'm going to allow for that, and I hope you will have that. Do you allow people to believe what they believe even if it differs from you? That's what the golden rule is about. If you treat people the way you want to be treated. You want to have freedom? Well, then you're going to have to give others that freedom as well. And so many people have not understood that very basic principle in America, who are promoting their religious views today. And it's turned religion into a very ugly thing by many people who want to impose their morality, who want to legislate their morality on other people. And that's why the separation of church and state has always been very important in the development of our country in America today. And so these are things that I believe in, and I will continue to teach here at Daniel Code Productions. And so what we find is there was a war that was started in the Middle East. The papacy, the Pope, sent the kings of Europe down into the Holy Land. And what happened was the Muslims who were there united together under religious leaders, caliphs and sultans, people like Saladin who united the Muslims to fight against the Christians. And so we laid this foundation. The King of the North, I believe, is still the papacy. It laid the foundation of our modern world today. And when they brought the cross there to represent their religion and to fight for it and to kill people, they seared the conscience of the Eastern peoples against the God of the cross for hundreds of years. And even still today, we have the remnants of that. We see the old fortresses of the Crusaders are still there on the lands that they built. And so there are the scars of the Crusades are still with us today. And in a way, that's how they became an abomination to people. When they began to impose their religion and kill and slaughter people in the name of their God, they were no longer representing the peaceful man, Jesus. And so when we find that those are the two of the three characters that were fulfilled from prophecy. The king of the north is the papacy from north of Jerusalem. The king of the south is Islam, centered in Mecca, south of Jerusalem. And that has brought us into our modern world today. And now there's another character, the God of forces. And I'm going to take a look at that with you today and see if we can understand who that character is. Daniel 11:38 and 39 says this. I'm looking at Daniel chapter 11 in verses 38 and 39. It says this, "Instead of them, he will honor a God of fortresses, a God unknown to his fathers. He will honor with gold and silver and precious stones and costly gifts. And he," that's the king of the north, the papacy, "will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god, and will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. And he will make rulers over many people and will distribute the land at a price." Now keep the big picture with me. Don't get too tied and hidden in the details here. We've got to see the forest for the trees sometimes. And here we see this new power arising, this God of forces who helps the king of the north, the papacy, to overcome the mightiest fortresses. And you may ask, well, who could this power be? Well, it says he's a foreign god. It's a god that's foreign to Rome. It's not near Europe. And it's a god his fathers knew not. It's a relatively new power that arose, I believe, in the New World from the United States of America, arising on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean in an unsettled place, a foreign god. And I have other evidence I'll give in a later presentation that will even make this more clear, because it parallels the two beasts of Revelation 13. We're going to get to that in the third presentation of the Abomination of Desolation. This is the number 1 of 3, and we'll have 2 more for you. So I hope you'll look at those. But one of the things that, as I look at history and look at modern history particularly, I look back at the fall of the Soviet Union, and we all know that the Cold War went on for a long time, a struggle between East and West. And what we know now as we look back on history is that in 1989 the Berlin Wall fell, and only later did we come to find out. There was an article written by Time magazine in 1992, and it was called The Holy Alliance. And it tells very specifically how Pope John Paul and President Ronald Reagan worked very closely together, covertly, to bring about the fall of the Soviet Union, which started in Poland with the working with Solidarity and Lech Walesa there. And John Paul was a Polish pope, you know, and he had a lot of roots there and networking there, and he had his power of the, you know, he does have quite a bit of influence. And so, but together they worked together to bring that down. And I believe that was a fulfillment of Daniel 11:38, where the mightiest fortresses, the United States, the USSR was a mighty fortress. It was a great challenge to the United States of America as a superpower. And once that power fell, there was only one superpower left in the world, and that's the United States of America. And it's very fitting that the God of fortresses, or forces, would be the last superpower that would be willing to have the power to impose his will on the Middle East. And we see that that is happening today. The United States of America is imposing its will all around the world for its own national interests, but it's fighting the war on terror and doing whatever is necessary to bring anyone who would differ with them, whether it's Iran, whether it's Egypt, and we're going to find actual countries named by name here in a minute. It is actually bringing all of those who would challenge them, including Muslim leaders, into submission. And let's look at that, if you will, in Daniel 11:43, because it's very specific here. It says, "He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and the riches of Egypt, with the Libyans and Nubians in submission." And as I said earlier, that I believe when we saw the Egypt, for instance, who the people there were rising up against their president Mubarak, and the United States of America's President Obama said that he should step down, and very soon thereafter he did step down, and they led this revolt there into new elections. And now the President Morsi, who is also trying to walk that narrow road of being a friend to the United States, and yet supporting the people of his country, which is not easily done. And then we look at, for instance, Muammar Gaddafi, what happened recently there. Muammar Gaddafi was not in submission to the West. He was an enemy of the West. He had weapons of mass destruction. He supported terrorism. But then after the United States went into Iraq, it seemed that he began to change his thinking, and he gave up his weapons of mass destruction. He allowed the Western countries to come in and do business again, set up a U.S. embassy there. And even after he had done all that, well, when his own people rose against him, the United States of America did not back him, but he told him to step down. And when he did step down, when he didn't do it, they brought in NATO, and the United States led from behind, as Obama would put it, and he then was he was killed, basically, for another to take his place. And so we see that Libya and Egypt have been brought into submission by the powers of the West. And we see that the United States of America, working with its allies, not all by itself, its allies such as Britain, such as Israel, such as the other European countries that support them and their sanctions against Iran, for instance, is working to bring the Middle East into submission. And as they do that, they're laying the foundation for this last event that we talked about, where the King of the North, the papacy, will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain, and there he will come to his end. But before that happens, it's going to be a sign for believers to flee. And I believe that there will be a time where we will go back to the Dark Ages. They will impose, they will legislate religious laws, even in America. And so we need to be prepared for that. And we want to warn other people about that so they won't be deceived by this last great deception that's coming. And so let's look at one other final verse in Daniel 12:10. It says this. It says, "Many will be purified and made spotless and refined, but the wicked will continue to be wicked, and none of the wicked will understand. But those who are wise will understand." And so my question to you today is, do you want to understand these things in Daniel? Do you want to be wise and be prepared? It says the wicked will not understand. Most people today will not understand this event that's coming very soon, the abomination of desolation as spoken by the prophet Daniel in the holy place in Jerusalem. And so I want you to be able to understand, and we've got obviously some more we want to look at. I've had one question that came to me as, when this time comes to flee, the question was, where would we flee to? And that's a good question. I'd like to address that. One thing that we're going to need to take with us when that time comes, there's only one thing we're going to need to take, and that's going to be a very strong faith. So I hope you will have faith by studying the Scripture, studying these prophecies. We're going to make them easy for you to understand, and even a child can understand these things. And many will come to me and they say, well, who are you to teach these things? You're not a scholar. And I've talked to many scholars throughout the years. I've studied at a Christian seminary, studied Greek and Hebrew, lived in the Middle East, studied Arabic, and had much experience in life. And, I say to the scholars that want to disagree with me is bring them on. Because I've talked to scholars, I've heard the different views. And frankly, if you have a better understanding of this prophecy, tell me about it. Let me know. You can email me at info@danielcode.com. I'd love to get your feedback. And I encourage you to study this for yourself. Don't take my word for it. I'm open. I'm teachable. I hope you'll be the same. I hope that we can stop some of the hate mongering that's going on. One of the things I've learned from my studies is I don't want to take sides in these ancient struggles that have been going on between peoples in the Middle East for thousands of years. We who are followers of Isa and of Jesus need to take a higher view and not get caught up in all the anger and the struggles that are going on today, but to understand the events, look at the signs rationally with our spiritual antennas up, and not get bogged down in all the rivalries and the national struggles that are going on in the world today, because we're called to a higher calling. And very soon, all those who are willing and interested will have a way of escape from this world that is falling apart. And we can all see it, all of us who have eyes to see, spiritual eyes to see. So come and continue to study with us. I welcome you. We want to be a blessing to you and not a curse. And we want to follow Jesus, the man of peace. And so I too am a man of peace and want to promote peace and understanding among peoples. So thank you for listening. And we'll be continuing to provide for you new materials. We have a monthly newsletter. You can sign up for it at our website at danielcode.com. Come and listen and join us, we ask. May God bless you.